lecture, we're going to talk about typecasting and type conversion. And I do remember I have to create a few video lectures on numericals related to filters in image processing, but I keep getting these requests regarding Python topics, so I have to take them as well. So let's talk about typecasting and type conversion. And yeah, your requests, your questions are always welcome, so keep them coming. When we're talking about type conversion or typecasting in Python, it is actually pretty much the same. As you see in the name itself, we have typecasting or type conversion. So it is like converting one type to another. Okay, so it's like we have different data types. So it is like converting int to float or converting int to string and vice versa and so on, right? So what is the main difference between these two? So let's start with typecasting first. Typecasting is converting, right? One type to another, and this is actually done. So this is what type conversion is, right? This is what typecasting is, and this is what type conversion is. So let's look at typecasting first. So we are converting one type to another, and casting can be done differently. It can be done by the user or it can be done by the compiler. So there are actually two types of casting. We have implicit and we have explicit. Okay, implicit is when user has to do it. Implicit is when compiler does it, so it is automatic, and explicit is when user does it, so we need some user involvement. Okay, and type conversion is nothing but implicit typecasting. Okay, there are two types of typecasting, implicit and explicit. Implicit typecasting is type conversion. Okay, so this is implicit typecasting. Type conversion is nothing but implicit typecasting, and since it is implicit, it also means that it is automatic, which means that it is done by compiler. Okay, so it is very automatic. It is automatic. What's very automatic? It is automatic. Okay, and I'll show you how. And when we talk about typecasting, we tend to talk about explicit typecasting. Okay, so what we do here is, it is done by user first of all. Okay, so it is all manual, right? And you should also understand why we need it, why we need explicit typecasting. It is because implicit typecasting does not work with all types. It does not work with all type conversions. Okay, so we'll first start with type conversion or implicit typecasting, and then we'll move on to typecasting or explicit typecasting. So let's first understand implicit typecasting. And as I told you, implicit typecasting is also called type conversion. It is done by compiler. It is automatic, so you don't have to do anything. First of all, what are different types that can be converted, right? So we have int, we have float, and we also have string, right? So you can convert int to float and string. Similarly, you can convert float to int and string, and you can convert string to int and float. Okay, so first we'll see how type conversion or implicit typecasting is done. Let's say you have an integer a with value 7, and then you also have another value which is float. So let's say 2.0. Now when you do C equals to A plus B, in a way you are trying to add two values of different types. Okay, you are adding integer with float value, right? But when you add these two values, the result is there, right? So in a way, type conversion is happening behind the scenes. It is automatic. It is done by the compiler, right? So if you check the type of C, it's going to be float. Okay, compiler knows that we had two values, one was integer, one was float, and it picks the float one. And I think I discussed the concept which value to which type compiler will prefer in one of the previous videos. And so it's going to prefer float here, right? So C is automatically converted into float. Similarly, if I have another variable D, and here I'm going like A multiplication D, so D will be converted to float, right? But this is not possible with all the types. For example, if instead of having an integer, A is a string, right? Because it is, I'm using quotes here, so it is a string. And let's say B is an integer or even float, right? And now if I try to add these two values, we are going to get an error. Why? Because it says can only concatenate string to string. So what that means is that if A is string and B is string, then it can perform concatenation, right? But otherwise, implicit typecasting or type conversion is not possible with all the types. Okay, that's why we need typecasting or explicit typecasting. Okay, because implicit typecasting is not possible with all the data types, so we need explicit typecasting. Now let's see how explicit typecasting can be done. So I'm going to take these examples. First, we are going to take an integer value and we will convert it to float and string. Then we'll take float value converted to int and string, and then we'll take string and do the same. Okay. So look very carefully now. So first we are going to convert integer to float and string. So very simple process. A is an integer. You can go like this, float A and all. I'm not going to take a separate variable. I'm just going to show the value. So float A, right? Integer is converted to float, and similarly I will convert this to string. Okay, you can see the difference. This is integer, this is 5.0, so it is converted to float, and this is 5 enclosed in quotes, so this is string, right? So integer converted to float and string. Now we'll take a float value. So A 987.645 maybe, and I'm gonna convert it to integer first, and then we'll convert this to string. Okay, simple. Now here it's going to convert the float value to an integer. Okay, it's not performing any rounding of values and all of that, right? If you want, you can do that. I'll show you how in the end. So this is a simple concept. If you have a float value, you're trying to convert it into an integer, you are using int function, it's gonna do the same, right? Now when we talk about string, if you have a string value, let's say A equals to 7, okay, you can convert this very well. It can become an integer and you can make it float, right? But if your string is something like this, so let's say it is 98.7, this is a string, it's not a float value, it is a string, and you try to convert this into an integer now, it's going to show you an error. Okay, so every time you have a string that is actually a decimal value, obviously this is not a float value, this is a string, right? But when you convert it directly into an integer without converting it first to float value, it's going to show you an error. Why? Because it is a string to integer thing, right? And so string to integer. Now there won't be any rounding off concept because you are not converting float to integer. Float is very well associated with rounding off and decimal values, but string is not associated with that. So when you're trying to convert string to integer, it's going to show you an error, right? Because there is no rounding off concept and result won't be precise or correct, right? So what you need to do here is first you need to convert this string to float, because that would make sense to integer function. It's gonna make sense to int function. So first you are going to convert this value of a to float, right? Now if you see here, I'm not using any decimal. Okay, so whatever value I'm converting, I'm not storing it anywhere, but in this case I need to store it somewhere because I'm gonna use it again, right? So first I need to convert it to float, right? So it is converted to float now. Now this float value is going to make perfect sense to int function, so I can convert this to int now, right? It is working, right? It is excluding the decimal part. It is picking, it knows what to do with the value, right? So it can relate more to float values. Int function here can relate more to float values than string values in decimal form. Okay, so remember, whenever you have a string and it is actually in the form of decimal, right, decimal value, you first need to convert it to float and then you can convert it to integer. Can't do it directly. Okay, and I talked about rounding off. So what I mean by that is, if you have, let's say, float value 9.9 and you convert this value to float, it's going to give you 9. Okay, so it's like when you have a float value, you are using int function, so you are performing int on it, right? So int knows that the output should be integer and it is given a float value. It's going to exclude the decimal part and it's going to give you float value. If you want that it should perform specific rounding, if you want the exact result, you have to include another function, round function, right? Because round function is used to actually round the values off. So instead of writing just int a, you will need to write round a and the result should be in integer. So it's going to give you 10. So this is also explicit type casting, and like I used round here, you can use as many functions as you want. Okay, you just need to have the basic understanding of what you're going after, what is the end result that you want. Okay, so I hope this was clear. Type conversion, type casting, implicit and explicit type casting. If you have any doubt, feel free to ask. I'll see you in the next video lecture. Till then, take care.